Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2024, the summer of Trek, the wrath of Book Trek. This is an event created by Vin at Revenant Reads, and as you can tell from the title, it's designed to read Star Trek fiction, with a couple of away missions for you to read nonfiction that's associated with Star Trek if you want. But there's an ocean of Star Trek fiction out there that you can read. I've been a Star Trek fan from the very beginning, and also an ardent reader the whole time I was a Star Trek fan, and even I haven't got to all of it. You miss things. And that might not have been true if back in the olden days some specialist magazine had hired me to the Star Trek beat. Well, then I wouldn't have missed anything. And maybe, for all I know, maybe one of you knows better than I do, for all I know, there are BookTube channels that are entirely devoted to Star Trek fiction and don't talk about anything else. I don't think I've ever found such a thing, and you'd think that in years of doing Book Trek, the algorithm would have put something like that in my path. But even so, I still find new Star Trek stuff to read and old stuff to reread, much to my profit. And I am a part of Book Trek. I am one of Captain Vin's Dauntless Bridge crew. And the other day, Brandy at the Booklectic was screaming at me to make another video, and you know how it is. You know how it is when these junior officers get uppity. So I don't know that she's my junior officer because I don't think we've quite figured out what I do on board the USS Revenant. Naturally, it gives me flashbacks, horrible flashbacks, to my decades working in retail bookstores. Uh, one of the things that I used to love was when some new store manager would come on board and he or she would be feeling out the staff and feeling out how things work here. Is there anybody that obviously needs to go? Is there anybody who's needs to be promoted? Anything like that? And they were told a number of different things about me, and always there would come a point where where that new store manager would turn to me, usually at my information desk, and say, usually comedically, they would say, "What is it exactly that you do around here?" I always used to love that. I would turn right away to the nearest customer and say, "Oh, that doesn't sound good." But anyway, whatever my role is on the USS Revenant, I am still a part of Book Trek, so I was guilted into it, and I read a Star Trek book last night. I don't think I've ever read this before. I think this is new to me. It's an original crew Star Trek novel. It's by William Leisner, and it's called The Shocks of Adversity. It would be nice to have a moratorium on cod literary references in Star Trek titles. That would be nice if we could do that. But this is an original crew episode. I think, from what I could gather, that most of the original series episodes have already happened. So this would be maybe a little bit late in the original 5-year mission of the USS Enterprise. 1701, no bloody A, B, C, or D. I could be wrong about that. It's not, I don't think, ever made 100% clear. But at a couple of points, Captain Kirk is reflecting on his role as captain of the Enterprise and how that distances him from his crew. In fact, that note comes up over and over again. As you're going to see, there's a reason why he would start to think about his role as the captain. And when he thinks about that, he thinks about the people who have slipped inside the penumbra of the mantle of authority and been his genuine personal friends. He thinks about Dr. McCoy, of course. He also thinks about Mr. Spock, and at one point, or actually at 2 points in the novel, he says that, sure, he's friends with Mr. Spock, but nothing like he was with his best friend, Gary Mitchell, before Gary died in the line of service, before he died in one of the earliest Star Trek episodes. And that sounds like something that the first-year Kirk would say, but not a later Kirk. The later Kirk, Spock is the best friend that Kirk has ever had. And likewise, and vice versa. So there were little contradictory things like that, but there were also characters in this book, 2 characters in this book from the animated show. The 2 alien characters that were added to the Star Trek cartoon, because the Star Trek cartoon didn't have to worry about believable costumes. So they added a 3-armed alien named Arix and a humanoid feline alien named Mures. they're in here, and there are a few other name checks for later in the show. So I'm not 100% sure when this takes place. I confess, original Star Trek, I like either when the crew is at the absolute peak of their youth together, but already meshed as the greatest bridge crew in the history of Starfleet, or original Star Trek novels that take place later, when they're older and more seasoned and have decided to forestall their own command careers in order to keep working together. I like stories set in those two. I didn't quite get the feeling that this was either one, but it's a bottle episode. It's very much a thing that could have been filmed if you'd had a bigger budget. Strange New Worlds could definitely film an episode like this, where the Enterprise they are exploring something called the Nistrum anomaly. As far as I know, no connection to the Kazon Nistrum from Voyager, and they're also exploring entire civilizations that might be in the Nistrum anomaly. And while they're doing that, they have a misunderstanding with a federation of worlds, a version of the United Federation of Planets called the Goeg Domain, Goeg Domain. They have a disagreement with the Domain, since I don't know how to pronounce the first word, we'll just call them the Domain. And that leads to the Enterprise being piecemeal, that leads to the Enterprise being badly disabled. Unable to go to warp. Crucially, unable to go to warp. Which changes everything. If you can't go to warp, suddenly if you're at best impulse speed, then suddenly instead of being a day away from the nearest starbase, you're years away from the nearest starbase. In this case, I think it was mentioned that they're 4 or 5 years away from the nearest starbase at maximum speed if they don't repair the warp engines. That changes everything, right? It reminds me of a terrific scene in Timothy Zahn's Star Wars book. I think it's Heir to the Empire. I think it's the first Zahn novel, where Luke Skywalker is just flying through space when suddenly there's a malfunction on board his little one-person spacecraft. Him and R2-D2 are on the spacecraft, and he drops out of hyperspace and is faced with the idea of never seeing civilization again when it was only hours away, until he has to do an evac and actually fix his vessel. But all of a sudden, the time frame and the operational scale of the novel telescopes down to one little guy on one little ship, because that miracle technology is no longer working. Well, same thing here. Where if the Enterprise doesn't get its warp drive back, they're going to spend a chunk of their lives getting back to the nearest Federation outpost. And they need the Domain's help to stop that from happening. So they learn more about the Domain, and it's a prickly, wary kind of learning process. They learn that the Domain is indeed a multi-species confederation of planets, and that the Domain has an uneasy relationship. They are in the process of putting down rebellions or long-standing irritations with a bunch of different species, including especially a species called the Tarpey. And the more Kirk and his crew learn about how the Domain do things, the more they see a very interesting alternate reflection of how the Federation might have done things. Here is a large conglomeration of warp-capable species who are engaged in a big collective spacefaring endeavor, but they're not a free conglomeration. It makes it interesting to think about what life in the actual Klingon Empire would be like. The Klingons, we hear over and over again, live to conquer. Well, they don't just conquer each other. There must be plenty of planets in the Klingon Empire that are not inhabited by Klingons. It makes you wonder what that is like. I think we get a small taste of what that's like in the original Star Trek episode that introduces the Organians. I think we see there what a Klingon occupation of a conquered world would be like. Here, you don't bring the Klingons into it here because that would be front-loading the plot. Instead, the author invents a group of people who do their Federation differently. It's essentially what this is that they do their Federation differently. in a way that Kirk, of course, doesn't like, and neither do any of his crew members, even though they have to work with these people to fix the Enterprise. Kirk starts to get to know the commander who is his opposite number. McCoy gets to know his opposite number on the medical staff of the Lapsus, of the corresponding domain ship. And all of that becomes more and more interesting. Not much more than that happens in the plot, but this author does a really good job. He does not write robotically, which is my number one complaint with most modern writers of Star Trek fiction, that they write robotically. Every single thing is explained very carefully. It's all very workshoppy prose. There's never any gamble taken with anything. Never anything in the way of outstanding prose. Certainly nothing in the way of outstanding character work. And that's not true in this book. The original characters are done really well here. We get some added dimensions. I don't think I caught a single thing that had the wrong tone to it. Of course, that's the thing that old Star Trek fans do with Star Trek fiction. We tone police. We go through it and see, okay, well, I want to know how interesting, how inventive your plot is, sure. And I definitely want to know how this works in with the tapestry of Star Trek continuity, which is, keep in mind, all on the screen, none on the page. But I also want to make sure you get the characters right. And I'll know to the finest degree whether or not they're right. One of the maddening things about all the earliest Star Trek fiction, this is 30 years, 35 years after Star Trek fiction was born, one of the most frustrating things about those early years of Star Trek fiction is how often the characters are not in character. Or one will be and all the others won't be, so you can tell which character the author liked the most. Here, not so much. No. There's nothing in the way of poetic prose here, but this, or really evocative prose, and the climax of the book. Well, I don't know. Maybe the author thought that the whole point of this is that the climax should be predictable. It certainly was. I enjoyed it, though. As an original Trek episode or adventure, I enjoyed it. And it gets me back in the saddle for Book Trek. I've been wayward on a few BookTube events. Summer of Sport, Book Trek. It's time I got back in the saddle for those. So this was good. I don't recall that I ever read this. So I will move on next time. I actually don't know what I'll add to the pile tonight. But I got to tell you, since I'm the world's biggest mood reader, I got to tell you, I'm feeling like a reread. Feeling like I want to reread something tonight. And that accounts for a lot of Star Trek. There's a lot of Star Trek that I've already read. Maybe a reread of something that I haven't read in a long time, 30 years, 40 years, see if it strikes me any different. We'll see. I will add something to the pile either tonight or tomorrow night, and I will report back. Thank you, BookTube.